Bienvenue sur cette première émission des entretiens de l'Issepien. Aujourd'hui, nous accueillons Monsieur Paul Gottfried, auteur du livre Fascisme, l'histoire d'un mot. Monsieur Paul Gottfried est professeur émérite à l'Elizabethtown College de Pennsylvanie. Il est docteur de l'université de Yale, où il a consacré ses recherches à l'étude de la droite américaine. Il fut notamment conseiller de Richard Nixon et aujourd'hui, c'est un intellectuel très influent des cercles conservateurs américains. Welcome, Mr. Gottfried.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you for joining our show. This is our first interview. This is the first interview of our newly established ESET student media. I'm Gordon, and this is my fellow interviewer, Jules. We are very glad that you could be our first guest for this interview, where we are going to talk about fascism. First of all, for our listeners who perhaps don't know you here in France, could you tell us a little bit about yourself? Where do you come from, and what's your interest in the questions related to what we call fascism?
I became interested in fascism as a graduate student, actually about 55, 60 years ago. And I find it a very interesting movement, much more interesting than communism or movements of the left, because it seems to be grounded in something that I think is real, which is nationalism. It is also a post-conservative movement. It comes along after the weakening and disappearance of a traditional conservative movement. Okay, so it sort of takes its place, and this is why it is important. It's also a movement very much rooted in a particular time period. Le période d'entre les deux guerres, n'est-ce pas? Mais avant la Deuxième Guerre mondiale. And it is because of its rootedness in this time period that it's important. I don't think fascism exists today as any kind of significant movement, because the circumstances which produced it, the cultural, political, social circumstances are not there. There are other movements of the right, but they're not fascist movements. I also see fascism as a movement of the right. And I do make a distinction, if you read me, between Nazism, which I think is as much influenced by Stalinism as it is by Italian fascism, and generic fascism, like the Falangistas in Spain, or the various fascist movements that developed in France in the 1930s. A movement like Action Française, to me, is separate, because it is really what is left of an old monarchist movement. And I think even the collaboration of Action Française with the Vichy government is somewhat questionable. I don't see much evidence of that. Most of the Action Française members fought against the German invaders, unlike the communists, who were pro-Nazi in this period, although later on they run around shooting all the so-called collaborationists, the collabos, who really were not, were usually victims of the communists. So I'm interested in fascism as an unsuccessful movement of the right.
The term fascist has become a very derogatory term. You just mentioned it's become a very derogatory term today. Most of the time it's used to insult or denounce people who disagree, or to discredit opposing opinions by assimilating them to totalitarian regimes of the 20th century. Well, could you give us your definition of the word fascism and tell us what its common misuses today implicate on scholarly research and our understanding of the concept today?
Yeah, I should say that right now, as I'm speaking to you, I am editing I'm thinking of the French Les Épreuves, mais dans le livre à venir, mais sur l'antifascisme, produit par moi. It's a book, a long book on anti-fascism, which traces the evolution of anti-fascism from its Marxist inception in the 1920s to its present use by what I call the post-Marxist left, which hates nationalism, which hates the white race, which hates Europe, which hates Christianity. this is what it is no longer the anti-fascism of the 1920s, you know. So I'm examining this, and the word fascism just means somebody I don't like. Mm. You know, somebody who doesn't hold my views and whom I'm trying to discredit. You know, it has no other meaning that I can find. It is very successful because fascism is now equated with Hitler, with Auschwitz, and so you really cannot get beyond this this association.
Exactly. So it's a way to completely like disqualify an opposing view from the debate.
Right. What I'm discussing is the total meaninglessness of the word by now, except, you know, as an imprecation. If you want to attack somebody, you know, it's sort of imprecatory rhetoric. It has no other meaning that I can find. Okay. And it is used by the ruling class to condemn other people, just the way the communists, when they were in power, said you were, you know, a capitalist collaborator or something like that.
Basically, it's just to shut people up.
Right, exactly.
Okay, so actually, I'm wondering, like, what makes fascism so like different from your authoritarian, your regular authoritarian regime or Nazism? Like, what's the actual difference?
I think fascism is, as Stanley Payne has pointed out, it is a form of authoritarianism which takes root in Europe, particularly in Latin countries, but also in some of the Eastern European countries in the interwar period. And it is associated with national revolution. It sees itself as a revolutionary force. Now, in this sense, it is different from authoritarian government. For instance, Franco or Salazar had authoritarian governments that were essentially governments of the right that tried to deal with leftist revolutionary threats. The fascists see themselves as a dynamic force. I mean, in this sense, they're like the communists. They're a revolutionary movement, but a revolutionary movement within a national framework. This is what distinguishes them. And they do not represent an international proletariat. They represent all the classes of their own nation or society. Now, there is an argument, you know, that is made by Ernst Nolte, who I find a very impressive historian, that fascism is a counter-revolutionary imitation of the left. It's a imitation contre-révolutionnaire de la gauche. And, you know, in German, es ist eine gegenrevolutionäre Nachahmung der Linken, or des Kommunismus. It is a kind of right-wing imitation of the left, but it's not really revolutionary. It's a pretense, you know, of the revolution and nothing more than that. Now, I think there's a certain truth in this. I think that the fascists at the end of the day are not really revolutionaries. They are counter-revolutionaries who use a kind of revolutionary guise and appeal to the ideal of national revolution.
Right. In your book, you happen to mention François Furet, who argues that the French Revolution inspired Stalinism and that fascism is essentially a reaction to this Stalinism. Is the struggle between fascism and communism simply a reenactment of the struggle between revolutionaries and counter-revolutionaries, or is it something different?
As a matter of fact, I think the French Revolution is a source of fascism. And it is interesting that the great fascist philosopher Giovanni Gentile saw not so much the French Revolution, the Italian Risorgimento, but the revolutionary Risorgimento, people like Garibaldini in Italy as proto-fascists. And there is no question that the French Revolution looks in several different directions. Fascism is one of them. So I do not buy the argument that fascism is just a reaction against the French, a counter-revolution. My position would be that there's much of the French Revolution that gets absorbed into fascism. The nation in arms, the nation fighting the enemies of the nation, the épuration, in which you have to wipe out the enemies of the revolution at home. All of this is in both communism and fascism. So I think the arguments that are presented by someone like Isaiah Berlin are utterly simplistic, simpliste. I think in the end, fascism is heavily influenced by the French Revolution. I cannot even conceive of fascism without the French Revolution.
That's very interesting. It seems to me that fascism is a very singular phenomenon, and that nobody ever agrees on what it is exactly. I mean, as you mentioned in your book, socialists like Guérin and Neumann argue that fascism is a form of advanced capitalism, and liberals like, Hayek think that fascism and communism are simply the two faces of the same coin. What's your take on that? I mean, do you have an answer on what the essence of the fascist movement really is?
Yeah, I'm not sure that there's two faces of the same coin. There is within fascism a counter-revolutionary element. It is a reaction against the left, but a reaction that borrows its ideas and its rhetoric from the French Revolution. I mean, you cannot. Somebody like Maurras, who was opposed to the revolution, is not really a fascist. And there are counter-revolutionaries like Mestre and others who are, and even someone like Hippolyte, who's a kind of biological determinist, but is anti-revolutionary. The fascists are not really, I mean, you say, why don't you like the French Revolution? Well, it's too international or something, but they borrow a lot from the French Revolution, and there's sort of a right wing of the French Revolution that fits into fascism very, very easily. Even though I think at the end of the day, it is against the left, but it's against the left in a way that borrows heavily from the French Revolution.
And I seem to recall that in your book you argue that there is something that resembles fascism in France in the mind of authors like Barrès, for example, who you qualify of proto-fascist, I think.
Yeah, this is the work of Zev Sternhell, Ni droite ni gauche, La droite révolutionnaire, who looks at France as the birthplace, le berceau du mouvement fasciste. I mean, you really have to look to the reaction against the defeat of France in the Franco-Prussian War, and the development of a right-wing form of nationalism afterwards, starting with Maurice Barrès. And
La terre et les morts.
Right, yeah, because it sort of takes over nationalism, which comes out of the French Revolution, and it turns it into a right-wing force. And I think it's absolutely right. I mean, France is the birthplace of fascism. That kind of what I call generic fascism, which is distinguishable, I think, from the Nazis. And from there it travels into Italy. Another important thinker is obviously Georges Sorel, des réflexions sur la violence. There is a very strong Sorelian influence on Italian fascism. So I think France is the birthplace of generic fascism.
Okay, and just to be sure, do you make a difference between those two notions, the generic fascism and the Italian fascism? Because, as you explain it, the birth of fascism in France is mostly intellectual, as in Italy with Mussolini. It seems that it's more of a political movement.
It is a worship of the state in Italian fascism. It's le culte de l'État, whereas the German is worship of the race. You don't really have that in French or Italian fascism. And I think they are more typical. I think German Nazism is different, one, because of its racism, extreme racism, and the other because it is a movement totalitaire in a way that the Italian or French or Spanish fascists are not. They're authoritarian, revolutionary, counter-revolutionary movements that borrow from the French Revolution. So I think they're different in not only in it's not only a quantitative, I think it's a qualitative difference.
Thank you. Can we talk a bit about this perception, this representation of fascism in the aftermath of the Second World War? You are very knowledgeable about deconstructivist and postmodern thinkers. You talk a lot about Adorno's, etc. Can you please explain the process of re-education that took place in post-war Germany that you mentioned in your book? And what are the dangers of this process?
I think what happens in Germany becomes the prototype for what happens throughout the Western world. If anti-fascism is interpreted as you have to control people's minds to destroy fascism, which is really, a mal de fascisme. I mean, it's like a sickness you're going to have to remove. And what you need is an all-powerful state, which is committed to changing people's attitudes, how they live, how they view each other, all in the name of fighting fascism. Now, this is tried out on the Germans who lose the Second World War, right? So you go in there and you say, well, Nazism, you have two ways of understanding it. One is the East German communist understanding, which is sort of less dangerous, in my opinion, because you say that they're capitalist, and this is an advanced capitalist society, which we have to destroy and replace it with communism. Then you have the West German path, which is re-education. The Umerziehungsprozess. You have to re-educate everybody. It goes on forever. And this is what the Allies are going to introduce. The French were sort of less interested. They just wanted to grab some land or take stuff. But the Anglo-Americans really love, this psychological reconditioning. This is very important. So you say fascism is really an illness. And it is an illness which comes from sadomasochistic attitudes, sexism, homophobia they didn't much care about. That's more recent. But from treating women in an authoritarian fashion and so forth. So we have to re-educate everybody. And you can't just stop it here. You have to just keep going on with this because these attitudes can come back. And the Germans are a particularly fascist-prone nation, right? So you have to work at it all the time. And you also have to say their entire past is evil. It's all tainted by fascism or pre-fascism. So you have to re-educate them entirely, pull down Bismarck as a proto-Nazi or Frederick the Great. This goes on even now in Germany. But then you discover it's not just the Germans who have this problem. It's the French, the English, the Americans, everybody else. Everybody is fascist prone because they're white, because they're Christians, because they were anti-Semites or sexists or something in the past. So everybody's going to have to be re-educated now. So what you do to the French, or the Germans rather, becomes simply a prelude to general re-education, which is going on now. So that's why the German situation is so interesting. I mean, not only because I grew up speaking German and this and understand them and speak and write German, but because I see this as being the prototype for what is being done all over now, right? I mean, it's being done in your country, being everywhere. And you have to go back, and you have to, let's say, remove the operas of Berlioz because they talk about some ancient Latin empire. which will lead to modern imperialism. I read this in Le Monde a few years ago. and I mean, it's absolutely insane, but it just goes on, has its own momentum.
So.
Yeah. There's no end. There's no end in sight. The only end is totalitarianism, complete control of every human being in the name of fighting fascism.
Yeah, actually, just staying in the topic of psychology, what do you reckon are the psychological foundations of the rise of fascism? Because I heard I heard a while ago that that it was related to World War I veterans, like hardened by war, coming back into society and being extremely violent. I heard that this was maybe one of the foundations of a rise of this fascist movement. What's your take on that?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, we're not talking about European countries that are irredentist and want to conquer other I mean, this is one aspect of Italian fascism. But the questions I always raise is, okay, you have something like the Rassemblement National in France. How is this fascist? I mean, if you want to control your borders, how is it? I have no idea. I mean, Hitler didn't spend time really trying to control his borders, or even, I mean, nobody cared about this back then. Or if you say that everybody must learn the national language, how is this fascist? I mean, the definitions have become so expansive that they mean nothing anymore. They mean just standing in the way of the left, of the multicultural left. This makes you a fascist.
Basically, yeah, exactly. That's what I was going to say. Basically, being to the right of the far left makes you a fascist, technically.
Well, of course, the left interests me too, and I did a book on the post-Marxist left. It is not Marxist. It is driven by hatred for Western civilization and for Western nations. There's nothing else, and for normal people. It's anti-bourgeois. It's anti-Christian. I mean, this is what it's about. It's anti-white. The crazy thing to me is, why do white people support it? I have no understanding. You know, it wants to destroy these people.
Actually, you mentioned that, just to stay on this topic, you mentioned that only fascism and communism are viewed as a political religion. But today, like in Western democracies, we also see that Western democracies also have their mythology and their dogmas, such as anti-racism that we've been talking about, progressivism, secularism. So, and these dogmas and mythology cannot be criticized. Otherwise, you might risk social and mediatic marginalization. So, I'm wondering that you can see today this self-censorship phenomenon, which is now deeply rooted in our Western societies. So, so maybe I'm not going out of topic here, but would you consider that liberal democracies could also be considered like some kind of a mild totalitarianism today?
Being too kind, I think it represents the most advanced sacralisation du politique. I mean, it is the ultimate religion of politics. I mean, and within that, everything you do has to be included. Like, you can only be a liberal Democrat if you have gay marriage, or you can only be a liberal Democrat if you have transgender dress rooms, or something like that. So that what they do is they then it does not have a fixed meaning any longer, right? It includes whatever progressives want, becomes part of liberal democracy, and it is sacralized. It is a religion. It is as much of a religion as fascism ever was.
So, well, do you have a theory? Do you have a theory on this mentality shared by many Westerners as to why they accept the situation being like this? Why they accept all this dogma? Do you have theory on that?
It obviously has religious roots. It has Christian roots. It is a kind of perverted form of Christianity. So it has dogmas. You have to convert people. They have to be converted to this nonsense. So it sort of takes over Christian, and it is particularly strong, I would argue, in Protestant countries, because you have a sense of guilt. The individual has to repent. And once you repent, you then lecture everybody else on moral questions, right? Like Merkel in Germany, who is the archetypal Protestant German maniac, you know, goes around converting everyone, and the whole world has to be converted. Just the way her parents, her father was a Protestant minister, he went to live under the communists to atone for being German. You know, he went in East Germany. So it has become a form of real fanaticism, these people.
Yeah, you're right, because we've noticed how like the most secularized anti-Christian people really speak in very religious terms. They have very religious notion as to good opposed to bad and things like that. So it's very ironic.
Right. No, it's exactly correct. I mean, it is a religion. And the reason it has to remove Christianity is because Christianity is a rival religion. People say, no, secular humanism, is it a religion or not? Certainly this cult of liberal democracy is a religion, or a kind of religious substitute. I mean, why should you be so concerned that every country have the same form of government in the same way as Germany or the United States does now, or this? Or you listen to Macron, you're a danger. I'm listening to his speeches. You're a danger unless you have the same kind of government, globalist government that he's organizing. Why? You know, I mean, you're no danger of any kind. But it is a conversion, or the thing that it's most like, I think, is probably communism, right? Because communism was a globalist ideology that preached equality. My argument is, in the course of winning the Cold War, the United States took over something similar to Soviet communism. It's globalist, it's conversionary, and it is totally intolerant.
You've said that communism and social democracy are both egalitarian. And I would like to quote you from your book. You say, fascists were on the right by virtue of having opposed the left in theory and practice, but that was not the same as standing for a past that was already in decline. So, as I understand it, conservatives, German conservatives like Kleist Schmenzin, were the ones who stood for this past and this tradition and this past order. Can you please define for us conservatism like you defined fascism?
Conservatism, to me, is a movement that comes into existence as a reaction against revolutionary change, particularly the French Revolution and its implications. It develops in the course of the 19th century, and it is centered on monarchy or traditional patrician republics of the kind that existed, let's say, in Switzerland or Holland. It typically stressed an alliance of throne and altar where that was possible, right? What do you call that in French? It was an alliance du sabre de l'épée et coupe. Yeah, it's an alliance. It's actually an alliance of the bishop's censer and the sword. And that was a term used in the 19th century. And it tries to maintain a traditional society in the face of change, of political change. It is only with reluctance that it accepts an extension of the vote, of the franchise. Okay, it is only with reluctance that it does this. And it stresses organic social ties. Now, if you notice, my notion of conservatism is one that is grounded in an historical reality of conservatism. It is not based on what the American conservative movement decides to call itself today or tomorrow, which has nothing to do with conservatism. It simply is what the left was yesterday or the day before. You know, it is nothing else. This is what I see as conservatism. Now, the right, I think, is different. The right is a reaction against the left, which is not always a conservative reaction. In the case of fascism, it was not a conservative reaction. It's sort of an imitation. It's an imitation of the left, and it's an imitation of conservatism. Right. So conservatism, to me, is grounded in an historical reality. that existed after the French Revolution, in reaction to the Revolution and to the Revolution of 1848. And then in the late 19th century in France, you have what's conservatism, you have a right. You know, you have the droite révolutionnaire that Sternhell writes about, which is what Barrès and these people are creating. I mean, they create a right.
So you do make a difference between the conservatives and the reactionaries. Those are not specifically the same thing?
All conservatives become réactionnaires at a particular point, right? Because they're reacting against the left. So and you know, in the case of, let's say, Spain in the Spanish Civil War, you have what is a right, the falangistas, the phalangists, but then the people who oppose, then you also have the traditional right, monarchists and people like that who joined this. Franco in the end is simply an authoritarian leader. He's a military authoritarian leader. But I think in the Spanish Civil War, you get a combination of right, reactionary conservatives, all these groups come together. Okay, now I think in the case of the Rassemblement National, you definitely have a movement of the right. But, you know, it's hard to say it's conservative because there isn't, I mean, what is conservative in France? I don't even know. I don't buy the argument that conservative is, you know, whatever happens to be on the right at a particular point. I don't think that's true. I don't think there's much left of conservatism, but I think we do have various movements of the right that are trying to contain the left, and the left is the dynamic force. And it is post-Marxist because it is less interested in economics than totalitarian social change. So I'm sympathetic to all right-wing movements in Europe. I mean, I support your movement. I support the Alternative for Deutschland. They're all fine. You know, I mean, if they can contain the left, which is what is the expansive totalitarian force, that's fine.
Okay, so just one last question, Mr. Gottfried. So when we look at movements such as BLM and Antifa, especially with their like black shirts and guise of like of uniforms, as well as their violent means of suppressing like their contradictors, we see that like we saw that the past few days in Paris, like extremely violent protests, and seemingly like the police is not like fighting back against these movements. It's very curious actually. So I can't help to think that there's some kind of like, at least visually, there's a resemblance between these violent movements and with fascists or Nazis. But as you said in the beginning of your book, you believe that calling someone a fascist is a baseless accusations regarding like historical like regarding the history of the concept. But is it fair, for example, for us to call these people, these movements, would it be fair for us to call them fascist, or would we be making the same mistake as our contradictors?
That's a good question, because in my book on anti-fascism, I devote an entire chapter to them. And I do believe that they behave exactly like the Nazi brown shirts, the Sturmabteilung in Germany. They're exactly the same. They're violent, they're hateful, they're nihilistic. They're not as positive as fascist, but they're just vicious groups. And the question is, what will the left do? I raise this question: what will the woke capitalists, the globalists, the people who are giving them money, what are they going to do to contain these people in the end? And I don't know. It wouldn't surprise me, as I indicate in my book, if they do what Hitler did to the brown shirts, just get rid of them all. Yeah. And claim that, you know, they're not really what you think they are. They're not for black people. They're really neo-Nazis. And this was the argument that was actually made in Minneapolis when they couldn't control these people, that they're really controlled by the Nazi right. You know, so this means that you can just go in and get rid of them if you want. So I think this is what's going to happen if they really act up too much. I think they're much worse than the squadristi with the fascists. I think they're worse. And there's no, you know, they just are free to shoot even black policemen if they want. and Biden's assistants were bailing them out of jail so they can go back on the street and do more of this. The Democratic Party in the United States is in alliance with these brown shirts, or black version of the brown shirts. So I think it's a very dangerous situation. I don't think Joe Biden is responsible because he's totally senile. You know, he's patrak. You know, he's sort of out of it all. You know, it doesn't become, but the people who control him obviously deal with him.
Well, reading your book was really interesting, and I can't wait to read your new one about the left. And that concludes our interview with Dr. Paul Gottfried of the University of Yale. Mr. Gottfried, thank you very much for taking some of your time to answer our questions and talk about your book. It was very, very nice of you.
It was a real pleasure. Merci à Monsieur Paul Gottfried pour cet entretien. Je le rappelle, son livre s'appelle Fascisme, histoire d'un mot. Et ceci conclut la première émission des entretiens de l'Issepien. Merci de l'avoir regardé. N'hésitez pas à vous abonner au compte YouTube, Instagram, Twitter et autres réseaux sociaux de l'ISEP pour être au courant de l'actualité de notre nouveau média étudiant. Et surtout, n'hésitez pas à commenter et à relayer cette vidéo. Merci beaucoup et à une prochaine émission. Merci beaucoup, Monsieur Gottfried.
Take care.